I think we might make a start just because, we've got an hour and it's a really interesting topic to get to. So I want to thank everybody for joining us for our first Birds Meet webinar of 2025. My name is Holly Parsons. I am the Manager of Priority Sites at BirdLife Australia, and one of the teams that I look after is my baby. It's the Urban Bird Program at BirdLife, and so we host these webinars to talk about all things related, sometimes very directly, sometimes quite indirectly, to urban birds. And I'm really excited to kick off 2025 with a very interesting session talking about the impact of light on our bird life, both in urban areas and very far beyond. And so I wanted to welcome Dr. Anne Aulsebrook to our session tonight. I'll give a little bio about Annie in a second. But I'll just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands everybody is calling in on today. I'm in Dharawal country, just south of Sydney. I want to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge the traditional owners on which everybody is dialing in on tonight. We have a setup of a town hall session tonight, which means that your mics and your cameras don't work. So you'll just see and hear from us. But we do have the chat function and we do have a Q&A function. So, pop in the chat if you want to have a bit of a discussion about some things. If you have specific questions for Annie, pop them in the Q&A. I'll keep an eye on it, and then I will make sure that we ask those questions, or as many as we can, at the end of the session. So I'm going to pop Annie in now. Here we go. Here she is. Welcome, Annie. Thank you so much for coming along tonight. Annie is an Alfred Deakin postdoc research fellow at Deakin Uni. So Annie's work is all about how birds sleep in different types of environments, particularly including things like urban environments and those affected by light and noise pollution. I'm sure Annie's going to talk to us a little bit about her far-ranging work, but before she was at Deakin Uni, she worked for the Max Planck Institute for Ornithology, where she studied the behaviour of shorebirds during continuous daylight in the high Arctic. So we're going to see the full gamut tonight of how birds can be impacted by natural and artificial light. So thanks so much, Annie. I'm going to duck out now and hand it over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Holly. So I'll start off as well by acknowledging that I'm presenting tonight from, hang on, sorry, just one moment. All right, got a bit of lag on my computer, but there we go. I think we're good now. Okay. Yeah, so I'd like to acknowledge that I'm presenting tonight from Wadawurrung country and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where a lot of the work that I'll be talking about took place. So that includes the lands of the Wadawurrung people, Wurundjeri people, and also the Inupiat people in Utqiagvik, Alaska. So thank you all for joining tonight for this talk. I know there are a lot of other places you could be or TV shows you could be watching, but I appreciate that you've taken time out of your evening to listen to me instead. And so I'd like to start by asking you to imagine what your options for entertainment might have looked like on a winter's night 147 years ago. So in August 147 years ago, there was actually a historic moment in Australia's history, one that you might never have thought about before. And it was the first ever footy match played at night under electric light. So let's paint the scene. You've headed out to watch the footy this evening. There's a lot of excitement, 10,000 people. It's a cold night, big crowd. You take your seat and there are kerosene lamps lighting up stands because they're not planning to turn on the electric lights until the actual game starts. It's East Melbourne versus Collingwood, and then the big moment when the game is about to start, the electric lights turn on, and they don't work particularly well. Actually, one of them immediately flickers out and dies, and the entire experience, from what reports say, was quite underwhelming. So they actually painted the ball white to try and make it a bit easier for people to see it. But even then, a lot of people just couldn't see where the ball was most of the time. The lighting was super patchy, so the men were continually going out of sight into dark patches where no one could see them anymore. And then at some point in the match, an argument broke out because the Collingwood players thought that they were opposed by more people on the other team than they were supposed to be. So they stopped play so they could count how many people were on the other team. They said there were 21. Their opponents, East Melbourne, said that wasn't true. There were only 20. And this argument continued, and the people in the audience in the stands watching the match actually thought the game had finished and started to go home. So you're not here tonight to hear about the history of footy in Australia, but I wanted to tell that story because I wanted to highlight just how much our world has changed in the last 150 years, from what was experienced then to what we just take for granted now. And 150 years might seem like a really long time, but when you consider that for more than 1 billion years, life on Earth has evolved with these 24-hour cycles of light and darkness, which are very predictable. And in that time, artificial light has completely changed our planet. So in the last couple of decades, researchers have started to become more interested and concerned about how this massive change to our environment is affecting wildlife, including birds. So I'll just give a few examples here of some of the effects that people have noticed. So one is altered singing behaviour at night. So some birds will sing more at night when there's artificial light than when there's not, while others, such as the willy wagtail, actually sing less when there's artificial light around. Light at night can also affect the physiology of animals and humans. So in captive zebra finches, we know that exposure to light at night can decrease melatonin, a hormone that's really important for regulating sleep and other day-night rhythms. And it can also, that decrease in melatonin is also associated with increased foraging behaviour at night. And while some birds might avoid exposure to light at night, others actually seem to seek it out. So there's some research finding that rainbow lorikeets actually prefer to roost near streetlights where it's more brightly lit rather than further away. So all of these things seem like they might contribute to and impacts on sleep in birds and in other species. So why does this matter? Well, some people would argue maybe it doesn't matter at all. Thomas Edison famously was quite opposed to sleep and has been quoted as saying, "There's really no reason why men should go to bed at all." But we know that that's just not true. Sleep is important. So I'm sure we've all experienced what happens to us when we haven't had enough sleep. Chances are you might even be experiencing this right now. So we know that without enough sleep, we have trouble learning. It can affect development, attention, motivation. Sleep is important for clearing waste from the brain, immune function, and insufficient sleep is associated with health risks, including increased risk of diabetes, obesity, stroke, and heart failure. And this isn't just true for humans. As far as we know, all animals need to sleep, and the loss of sleep can have quite devastating consequences sometimes. But stepping back a bit, we need to also define what sleep actually is. So for us, we have a good sense of what our experience of sleep is and what sleep looks like in humans. But it gets a little tricky when you start talking about other animals and what their sleep might look like. So for example, what does sleep look like in a sloth, which spends almost all its time sitting very still and camouflaged? Or how would you say that a dolphin is sleeping when dolphins are almost always on the move, even when they are asleep? So we need to be able to define sleep, and sleep scientists generally agree that sleep has 5 key characteristics. So the first of these is decreased responsiveness. So when an animal is asleep, it's going to be less responsive than when it's awake. Pretty simple. Second is that sleep is rapidly reversible. So that's how we distinguish sleep from, say, being completely unconscious or in a coma. An animal can go from being asleep to being awake very quickly. Sleep is also homeostatically regulated. So the more time you spend awake, the more you feel sleepy and that need to sleep, and vice versa. When you've slept a lot, you start to feel less sleepy and more awake, hopefully. And sleep can also be associated with characteristic resting behaviours or postures. Although, like I mentioned before, this can be a little trickier to define for some animals than others. And sleep is also associated with changes in brain activity. Now, you might have noticed that all of these other points are a little ambiguous at any given moment in time, or might require you to actually wake up an animal to figure out whether it was sleeping. So, for example, checking that this is rapidly reversible or that the animal is less responsive than before. So this is partly why measuring brain activity is actually generally considered the gold standard approach to measuring sleep. The other reason why is that brain activity can tell you not only whether an animal is sleeping, but also what kind of sleep it is. So birds and mammals and some other reptiles have two main types of sleep, called rapid eye movement sleep and non-rapid eye movement sleep. And these sleep states are thought to have different functions, and they can be distinguished from each other based on brain activity and also the electromyogram, which is a measure of muscle tone. So non-REM sleep is associated with these large, slow waves of brain activity, while rapid eye movement sleep, or REM sleep, is associated with these shorter, faster waves. And the amplitude of these slow waves during non-REM sleep can also tell you how deep an animal is sleeping or intense the sleep is. So when these waves are higher amplitude, an animal is harder to wake up. So this is really useful if you want to be able to have some objective measure of sleep in an animal, including a bird. So now that we know what sleep is and how we might measure it, we can ask this question: does artificial light at night disrupt sleep in birds? So this question formed the basis of my PhD thesis, which I did at the University of Melbourne with Raoul Mulder, Trace Jones, and John Leskew. And the first thing that we did in this project is we looked at whether light at night affected sleep in pigeons. Why pigeons? That might seem like a bit of a boring choice, maybe. Not a native bird, but they're common in urban environments. We know more about sleep in pigeons than in any other bird. They've been really well studied. They're relatively easy to study in a controlled captive environment, although those things are all relative. There's always, of course, going to be challenges. And also getting permits for working with black swans, which is what I actually set out to do at the start of my PhD, was proving to be a bit of a nightmare. So John suggested, let's get some pigeons instead and make a start on this. So it was a very simple experiment. We had 9 pigeons. Actually, we had more than 9 pigeons, but some of them didn't cooperate particularly well. We had 9 pigeons. We had these data loggers that recorded their brain activity or sleep electrophysiology on their heads. First night, we had them in the lab. We had the lights off. On the second night, we turned on these street lights. So these were set up to mimic what light might be like if this pigeon was roosting near a street light in an urban environment. And then on the third night, the street lights were switched off again, and we recorded sleep all the way throughout. So this plot here shows you the hours since the start of the day on the x-axis, And then up here we have the percentage of time the bird spent in non-REM sleep. So what we can see here is that on this first night, the baseline night when the lights are off, the pigeons spent most of their time at night. So this is the left-hand side, spent most of the night in non-REM sleep. And then they had some non-REM sleep during the day, maybe spent like 30% of their time in non-REM sleep. But when the lights were on at night, we see this big reduction in how much time the birds spent in non-REM sleep at night. And then they seem to spend a bit more time sleeping during the day to compensate. Then on the third night, when the lights were off again, the birds went back to their normal sleep pattern. In REM sleep, we see something somewhat similar. So REM sleep makes up a smaller percentage of sleep in birds in general. So on this first night, the birds spent, 5 to 15%-ish, a bit less of their time sleeping. So REM sleep was particularly towards the end of the night, and very little REM sleep during the day. Then we see this drastic reduction in REM sleep when the lights were switched on. And then the following night, when the lights were switched off again, we see this rebound actually, where the birds spent more time in REM sleep at night than they normally did, or they did on the first night, suggesting they're recovering some of that sleep they lost. So overall, we found that during exposure to light at night, the pigeons slept 4 hours less in a 24-hour period, which is a pretty big difference in how, if I've slept 4 hours less than usual, I feel pretty awful. They had less REM sleep as a proportion of their total sleep. They slept less intensely, so that's based on those slow waves that I mentioned before, suggesting that they were, that their sleep was a bit lighter and they would have been easier to wake up, and might not have been giving them the same benefits. And they woke up more often. And then after that exposure to light at night, the pigeons slept more, and they didn't seem to recover all of the non-REM sleep that they lost. And they continued to sleep less intensely, which was interesting. So they're not able to quickly recover in this context. So if light is bad for sleep in birds, which at least in this lab study, it seemed to be, the question that followed from that for me was, well, are some types of light worse than others? So I mentioned before this idea of light suppressing the hormone melatonin, and melatonin being really important for regulating sleep and other day-night rhythms. And so I was interested in whether we know that melatonin is particularly sensitive to blue wavelengths of light. And this is across the board. In birds, humans, it's quite a conserved mechanism. So if you were to reduce the blue wavelengths of light, maybe that would have less of an impact on melatonin and less impact on sleep. And that's actually why so many of your electronic devices will have these night light settings that will make everything look much more orange. And so the idea is that that should reduce the impact on melatonin and also improve your sleep. So the question then is whether we can help urban birds to sleep better by switching from these cold white LED lights, which emit a lot of these blue wavelengths of light, to more blue reduced amber lighting. So to test this idea, we ran another very simple little experiment. We had the pigeons in 2 different rooms. First night, lights were off. And then on the second night, birds in one room were exposed to this white blue rich light, which was the same light actually as what was used in that first experiment. And then in the second room, birds were exposed to light that had the blue wavelengths reduced. So that light appears more amber, but was otherwise very similar. And then we repeat this, but switch the 2 treatments. And what we found was that amber light had the same effects on sleep actually as white light. So we found no difference in total amount of sleep, total non-REM sleep, total REM sleep, sleep composition, sleep intensity, or the number of times the birds woke up. So this was completely contradictory to what I had expected and actually hoped to find. I was hoping I'd find like a simple solution to be like, all right, everyone, let's use more amber lighting in these urban parks and in these types of settings, but it just didn't seem to have any benefit at all. But the interesting thing was that around the time I was doing my PhD, there was another student in my group, the same group as me, Farley, who was doing some work with Australian magpies. So he was actually looking at the impacts of noise pollution on sleep. But we wondered, well, if he has these magpies here, what if we run the same experiment with them? Or a very similar experiment, and we see whether amber light is better for magpies, see if we find the same results. And we found something quite different. So in the magpies, amber light was better for sleep overall. So when magpies were exposed to amber light, they slept more and they slept more intensely than when they were exposed to white light. So there seems to be some interesting species-specific things going on here, which we still don't really fully understand. And what about outside the lab? So everything I've talked about so far has been done in aviaries at the university, not a particularly natural setting. So to try and see what would happen in a bit more of a natural setting, we ran another experiment, this time finally with black swans. So why were we interested in working with black swans? Well, for those of you in Melbourne, we have this population in Albert Park Lake that has been studied for 20 years or more. These birds are large, which is handy if you want to put a data logger on them. They are quite easy to capture by hand for research. And they already have these individual collars to identify them. So we know a lot about the history of every individual bird. And so what we did is we transported some birds from Albert Park to Serendip Wildlife Sanctuary. And we kept these birds in these outdoor enclosures where we could set up real streetlights that were donated by a street lighting company. And we exposed them for 20 nights to the lights in this outdoor, reasonably natural setting while recording their activity. And in a couple of birds, we also managed to record the brain activity. And what we found was that there was a small effect, but not very, relatively small effect of the amber lights, only the amber lights, on nighttime rest in swans. So when the swans were exposed to amber streetlights at night, they spent a bit less time resting. But we found no effect on the total amount of rest they got each day. They were compensating a little bit by sleeping in a little bit. Their daytime behaviour was the same, and we found no effect on melatonin when we took blood samples. And we also found no evidence that the effects decreased over time. So it's not like the swans were getting used to it. But these were swans from urban environments, and so maybe it's possible that they have already adapted to cope quite well with light at night. Interesting to think about. So overall, these studies found that urban lighting, levels of lighting can disrupt sleep in birds, but these effects can vary depending on the species and also maybe the context, like the environment that the birds are in. We found that amber lighting sometimes, but not always, had less impact on sleep than white lighting. So beneficial in the case of the magpies in that study, but no benefit for the swans or for the pigeons. So this leads to this question then of, to what extent can birds cope or adapt with these changes in their sleep patterns and with these changes in their environment? And to help answer this question, we can start to look for examples in nature where birds might experience extreme lighting conditions, but for other reasons. So I mentioned before that life on this planet has evolved with 24-hour cycles of light and darkness, which are very predictable. But of course, there are some exceptions. So One exception that I've already talked about is due to artificial light at night. But another exception is at the poles during summer, where the environment is exposed constantly to daylight. So this is Utqiagvik, Alaska at midnight. So this is what midnight looks like there in early summer. So the ocean is frozen, and for months at a time, the sun never falls below the horizon. And every year, many, many birds migrate up to the tundra to breed under these constant light conditions. And one of these birds is the pectoral sandpiper. So the pectoral sandpiper, when it's not breeding, is found mostly in South America, but also occasionally around Australia and New Zealand. And then they migrate all the way across the globe to breed on the tundra in the high Arctic. And a few interesting things about these birds. One is that males can mate with multiple females. Competition for opportunities to mate can be extremely intense. And males do not care for the offspring at all. So they leave the female to do all the incubating and raising the young. So that means that a male's reproductive success is defined entirely by the number of females that he manages to mate with. And so when they arrive, I'll say first that so this is all occurring under this constant daylight. So theoretically, males can compete around the clock for these opportunities to mate with females. And a study back in 2012 found that that's exactly what some males do. So some males were active for more than 95% of the time for weeks. And in this study, activity was measured based on these interaction tags on the birds. So when the signal between the bird and a central tower varied, then that suggests that the bird's either moving closer or further away or changing its orientation. And some of these birds were active for more than 22 hours per day, which is confirmed by recording the brain activity of some of the males. So bear in mind, these birds usually sleep about as much as we do. So imagine how you would feel and how maybe messed up your behavior would be if you were only sleeping 2 hours per day for 2 or 3 weeks. And maybe the wildest thing about all of this is there didn't seem to be any costs for the survival of these birds. So the birds that were the most active were actually the ones that were most likely to return the following year and do the same thing all over again. So this seems to defy everything we understand about the importance of sleep for performance. So how do they do it? So there were some questions that we wanted to look into in relation to these birds. So one was, are these males increasing their activity when there are more females around, or are there just some males who are generally more active than others? Does the intensity of activity matter? Are these males just kind of pottering around, keeping an eye on things, or are they performing these really intense displays all the time? And what are they actually doing with their time? So there are some opportunities to try and answer some of these questions a bit better using new technology. So there are now accelerometers, which are small enough to fit on a bird of this size. So accelerometers, as the name suggests, record acceleration, and we can use this to measure activity directly and also to estimate energy expenditure. I won't go into too many of the details here, but that's the basic concept of what these data loggers can be used for. So this project was one that I worked on when I was working in Germany with the Max Planck Institute for Ornithology. And so it might seem counterintuitive to move to Germany to do work in Alaska, but there you go. And our team, it was a huge team of very experienced people, and I was very, very lucky to work with them. So I'm just going to show a bit of a video of the study site. This won't have sound, but so this is overlooking Utqiagvik, Alaska, where over the tundra where the birds are breeding. So every year the males arrive here and they form territories, which they defend using these hooting flights. So this low hooting call. And they also court females using these ground displays. And then once mating is done, the males will leave the site and the female will be left to incubate the eggs, raise the offspring. So we caught birds at the site using these handheld mist nets. So a bird flies through, hopefully a bit distracted, scoop him up in the net. Then after we get him out of the net, we can do things like take a small blood sample and attach this data logger, which is recording the accelerometry data. The bird is then released, and then the data is transmitted from the bird to these towers, which we set up on the site via Bluetooth. So we'll continue to collect the data from the birds until they leave the study site again. And during this field season, we also did this really intense search for nests across the site. So we were able to find nests and take small blood samples from the chicks and use those to figure out who the parents of each nest were, so who the father was in particular. And we could also figure out when the females were most likely to have been fertile based on their laying and hatching dates. So I'll talk through just some preliminary results from this project. We haven't published these yet, so they still need to be submitted to a journal for peer review. But what we seem to have found so far is that breeding males increased activity at the expense of rest, and that on average, males increased their activity by more than 10 hours per day during the peak of the mating period compared with the non-mating period. That's pretty massive change, right, in how much time these birds are investing into activity, and considering, the likely impact of that on their sleep. And the males that were more successful, so the males who mated with more females, were more active than their rivals. And that wasn't just in terms of the amount of time they spent active, but also how intense that activity was, so the energy expenditure associated with activity. And based on this and based on our observations in the field, we suspect that these high-intensity displays that the males perform when they're defending their territories and trying to court females are probably important for success. So one of the next steps of this project is looking more into how these males are spending their time in activity. So that accelerometry data that we collected, we can use it not only to figure out how much time a bird spends active and how intense that activity is, but you can get particular signals and signatures and patterns in that data associated with different behaviours. So what we're hoping to do, and what we're working on at the moment, is distinguishing different behaviours from this acceleration data to figure out exactly how the birds were spending their time. So that will include not just only whether the bird was flying, but what type of flight that was, whether it was this hooting flight where the bird goes up and down like this, or whether it was more of these males do these crazy vertical flights where they size each other up and then fly straight up into the sky really, really, really fast. And so get a better sense of what behaviours are important and how that influences the time budgets of these birds. So to sum up this part of the project, so in a natural setting, we know from this study and also some other studies that have come out, particularly in the last 5 years, that wild birds can show huge variation in the amount of time they spend active each day and the amount of time they spend sleeping. So that comes back to this question again of to what extent can these birds cope with these changes in their environment caused by urbanisation, and how flexible are these activity patterns overall? So the next steps for this project will be looking at, well, next steps for my research anyway, is I'm interested in understanding a bit more about how birds select roost sites, whether they're avoiding artificial light or maybe even attracted to it like the lorikeets are. We don't know that much about roost site selection in a lot of Australian birds. I'm interested in knowing whether urban populations are less sensitive to disturbance than rural populations, which might suggest that they're adapting over time and might be able to cope better with these changes. And also whether urbanisation is driving birds towards increased nocturnality in general, and what the implications of that are. If there's been some work in mammals that have found that mammals in more disturbed environments tend to be more active at night and less active during the day. So I'm interested to know whether that could be the case for birds as well. So I have recently received some funding from the Australian Research Council to start pursuing some of these ideas a bit more, which is really exciting. But in the meantime, I mean, there's always more questions to answer, but there's also things we can do in the meantime. We do know that light pollution can have a lot of impacts on wildlife, and that many of these impacts can be negative. So it's just some tips for reducing light pollution. One is to turn the lights off when they're not needed. Keep the lights no brighter than what you actually need. You know, we don't need to have super intense flood lighting for everything that we do outside. And the other thing to consider is shielding lights to reduce the spill, to make sure lights are actually only shining where we really need them to be. So that can be to do with lighting design. And so that's something we can ask our councils and consider also in the types of lights we put up in our yards or events or gardens. But the other really simple thing is we tend to close our curtains to keep light out of our house, but close curtains to keep light out of the garden as well. So keep light inside and close curtains so that it's not then spilling out into the street and affecting the sky glow and the environment that all the other animals that share our space are using. So I'd just like to thank again everyone who was involved with these projects. Like I mentioned, these are real team efforts, and I'll especially like to mention that that video I showed of pectoral sandpipers was filmed and edited by Luke Eberhardt. And I'll just leave this up while we potentially take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annie. That was amazing. Such wide-ranging research and really, really interesting stuff. Thank you so much for tonight. I really appreciate it. We have hit some technical issues, and so we're going to have to record and share this out with the bulk of the attendees. So massive apologies for that, but we'll get this recording out to everybody first thing tomorrow. So I think we're going to leave it there unless anybody has any pressing questions that they want to ask. I don't see anything popping in, so I think we'll just say a massive thank you to everybody who was able to make it tonight. And Annie, a huge thank you for sharing your amazing research with us and doing such a great job researching such an interesting and really important topic, particularly as we continue to urbanise and the way we take up space in the day and in the night changes. I think this is going to be a really interesting area to keep working in and seeing on what sort of impacts we're going to continue to have on wildlife in general. So thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, Annie. I really appreciate it. Good night.
No problem. Thank you.
Good night.